Welcome to the final module of MGT 190, which covers what a company needs to execute strategy and the role played by leadership and company culture during the process. We are finally at our final topic, implementation and execution, and the need to constantly iterate on your strategy to improve your company's competitive position. Unfortunately, this is a topic that is impossible to teach in a classroom, so the best I can give you is theory. Actual application depends on how good you are as a manager and relies very heavily on your soft skills. Human beings are resistant to change. This one inconvenient truth complicates the implementation of a new strategy, and it takes adept leadership to convincingly communicate the reasons for the new strategy, overcome pockets of doubt, secure commitment from concerned parties, build consensus and enthusiasm, have all implementation pieces in place, and finally to coordinate the execution. To implement a chosen strategy, managers ideally need to create a company-wide crusade as fast and effectively as possible. What do you need to execute properly? First, you need to either have or build the right organization, which means assembling a capable team of managers and employees. Second, you need to correctly structure the work effort. Third, you need to have policies and procedures that support execution. What do we mean by that? Your policies and procedures are intended to provide top-down guidance on how things should be done, and should enforce consistency in how activities are executed across geographically scattered units. Having the right set of policies and procedures promote a work climate of good strategy execution. An example of a company with strict policies is McDonald's, especially when it comes to food handling. Their policy manual has strict rules on the shelf life of its various products, such as 10 minutes for regular hamburger meat before it has to be thrown out. This is 30 minutes for a quarter pounder, but only 20 minutes for chicken nuggets and filet-o-fish. However, don't go overboard with policies because too much policy will hinder execution. Set white lines to provide direction and to guide personnel, but allow employees the freedom to operate along the boundaries. A company also needs the right set of information and operating systems that support its personnel. Having the right systems lets a company compete more effectively on its chosen strategy, such as differentiation or cost leadership. For example, FedEx needs sophisticated communication systems that can coordinate over 200,000 vehicles to handle 18 million shipments per day in 220 countries. Google maintains and continually improves its search algorithms that allow it to visit, summarize, and index billions of web pages, sometimes multiple times a day, and return the results in milliseconds. This takes a lot of computing power. Finally, here is a short video from Amazon explaining how its extremely sophisticated order fulfillment system works.
At this station, you can see how our inbound associate receives a product and how those products are stowed in our inventory. Amazon robotic drive units are activated when an associate logs into their workstation to perform their task. Storage pods arrive facing the correct side to stow items into inventory. Every time an associate touches a product, they scan a unique barcode for that item, which we call the Amazon Standard Identification Number, or ASIN. That's stored in our inventory system so we know what the quantity and location of that item is at any given time. Now, you might expect that we'd organize this in a way where similar items are stowed together. For example, all electronics would be stored in the same section. However, at Amazon, we've found that it's more efficient to stow products using a randomized method. That's why you'll see a variety of items in each inventory bin. Once that process has been completed, a physical and digital match is created in our systems. So just a few seconds after an item is stowed, you can order it on Amazon.com. Looking at a station next door, we see a great example of computer vision helping with automation. When an associate scans an item, you'll see magenta lights over some of the bins in the pod. This lets the associate know not to place that item in those locations, as artificial intelligence-driven logic has determined that the bin is full, that placing an item there may negatively impact the pod's overall weight distribution, or that a visually similar item is there and may cause confusion later when an associate needs to pick the item. The associate can then place the item in any of the other bins. But computer vision doesn't stop there. It will also detect what bin the associate reached into and knows where that item is placed. As one final step, it will take a picture of the pod and use image recognition to count the number of items in the bin, making sure the count matches what is recorded in our tracking systems.
The last factor required is to have strong leadership, which of course refers to your personal characteristics and capabilities as managers. We will have more to say about leadership later. A company needs to do the following to facilitate execution. First, it must develop resources and organizational capabilities. Second, it must allocate sufficient resources in the form of money, employee time, and managerial attention. Each organizational unit must be properly funded so they can execute their roles in the overall strategic plan. If you provide too little funding, then the unit cannot operate at its best. If you provide too much funding, you're wasting resources because each division can find ways to spend all the money it was allocated. Since resources are limited, this entails hard choices in resource allocation. Strategically important units may need new people, equipment, facilities, and higher budgets, while those that are less important may have to go on a diet. Use portfolio models such as the BCG matrix or the McKinsey 9-cell matrix to allocate resources, keeping in mind that the firm's operating budget must be driven by its strategy and be as lean as possible to operate cost efficiently. Third, it must strive for continuous improvement and operational excellence. Fourth, it must create a compensation system that ties rewards and incentives to achieving targets. And finally, it must cultivate a corporate culture that supports strategy. How do you build an organization that can execute strategy? There are three main building blocks. First, you must have, or if you don't, you must assemble the right people to work in the management team as well as overall talent. This requires hiring workers with the right experience, skill, and intellect for your company. Second, you need to develop and improve your expertise in critical value chain activities and build your core competencies, updating them constantly to match ever-changing market conditions and customer expectations. Third, you must structure the organization and work effort. Let's dive a little deeper into these building blocks. How do you make sure you get the right people? First, screen them properly even before they are hired, selecting only those candidates with the suitable skill sets, the right mix of energy, initiative, and judgment, the right aptitude for learning, and people who are able to adapt to the firm's work environment and culture. Second, run training programs throughout the employees' careers to develop their skills. Third, provide them with assignments that are challenging, interesting, and will stretch the abilities of employees. Fourth, rotate them through jobs that span functional and geographic boundaries. Job rotations are typically lateral in nature, and employees return to their original position after getting a good perspective of the company and its businesses. This is especially important when you are looking for candidates to replace top management. Fifth, encourage employees to contribute by challenging the existing ways of doing things and proposing better ways to do it, to be creative and innovative, and to push their ideas for new products and businesses. 6. Make the work environment stimulating and engaging. You don't want your employees to get bored and leave. 7th, strive to retain high-potential employees with attractive compensation and benefits. And 8th, coach average performers to improve their skills and weed out underperformers. Some well-respected companies like GE under Jack Welch ranked their employees on a curve and terminated those who placed in the bottom 10% in 2 consecutive years in a controversial practice called stack ranking. Other organizations, Particularly companies in consultancy and law, the military, and universities have an up or out policy in which someone who doesn't get promoted in a given number of years must leave the company. As we discussed in earlier modules, the challenges of building core competencies is to turn your strengths and capabilities into core and even distinctive competencies. They hinge on leadership and strategy, or doing the right things, management and competitive advantage, or doing things right, and constant repetition and refinement to ensure that you are doing them in ways that are better than your rivals. There are three general approaches to building core competencies. You can develop them internally, buy them in an acqui-hire, or borrow them by partnering with other firms. The third building block is structuring the work effort and includes using value chain analysis to decide which activities to keep and outsource. As mentioned in an earlier module, be careful that you don't outsource too much, that you risk hollowing out your capabilities. Clayton Christensen writes the following cautionary story about Dell and its outsourcing to ASUS in his book, How You Will Measure Your Life. In the early 1990s, Dell entered the computer market as a company selling mass-customized personal computers. One of its sources of competitive advantage was a small company in Taiwan called ASUSTeK, which supplied it with simple, reliable circuits for use in its motherboards. The rest of the story, please allow my robot voice to read to you in Christensen's own words.
ASUS came to Dell with an interesting proposition.
We've done a good job making these little circuits for you. Let us supply the motherboards for your computers too. Making motherboards isn't your competence, it's ours, and we can make them for a 20% lower cost.
The Dell analysts realized that not only could ASUS do it cheaper, but it would also allow Dell to erase all the motherboard-related manufacturing assets from its balance sheet. After it had reorganized to accommodate this arrangement, ASUS came to Dell and said,
"We've done a good job fabricating these motherboards for you. Why don't you let us assemble the whole computer for you too? Assembling those products is not what's made you successful. We can take all the remaining manufacturing assets off your balance sheet and we can do it all for 20% less."
The Dell analysts realized that this, too, was a win-win. As ASUS took on the additional activity, ASUS's return on net assets increased as the numerator, net income, got bigger, while the denominator, net assets, got smaller. That process continued as Dell outsourced the management of its supply chain, and then the design of its computers themselves. Dell essentially outsourced everything inside its personal computer business, everything except its brand, to ASUS. Then, in 2005, ASUS announced the creation of its own brand of computers.
ASUS started at the low end, and thanks to Dell steadily outsourcing more and more activities to them, gained more and more capabilities until it was in a position to compete directly with Dell. A company needs to make sure that its organizational structure is compatible with its strategy. The most basic way to organize is to simply have a simple or flat structure, where a central executive makes all the decisions and is supported by a handful of staff. This type of organization is extremely nimble and is most suitable for small companies and startups. It's not very practical once the company grows larger, because the one person in charge will quickly be overwhelmed by the volume of decisions they have to make. A functional structure organizes the firms into departments that represent major components of the value chain. So you might have a production department, a marketing department, and a finance department reporting to top management. This is an efficient way to organize, but may result in silos, where the heads of departments may try to carve out spheres of influence and fight to hold their turf. This is best used for companies operating in a single line of business where efficiency is very important. A multidivisional organizational structure segments a company along market, customer, product, or geographic lines before layering the functional departments within each segment. This is a decentralized structure that is used for companies pursuing diversification or global strategies. Finally, a matrix or composite structure overlays one structure onto another in order to enhance cross-unit communication. This is typically done for limited duration projects because one person will essentially be reporting to multiple bosses, and this can get confusing rather quickly. Other ways to structure the work effort is for top management to decide how much authority to delegate and how supportive they will be for intra-company collaboration, as well as cooperation with external parties and strategic allies. How much power to delegate is a matter between choosing a position anywhere between the two extremes of centralization and decentralization. Both viewpoints have different beliefs. Centralization believes that higher managers have the right set of skills to make the best decisions for the company, while decentralization believes that people who are closest to the situation should be the ones to make the decision. Centralization considers frontliners as too close to the situation to be able to make the objectively best decision for the company, while decentralization believes in holding people accountable for their actions. Because centralization has a top-down structure where power comes from above, a centralized system is characterized by tight control, where accountability is always fixed. Since the ones making the decision have the entire picture in their minds, it is very useful in responding comprehensively to crisis situations. And since responsibilities and job descriptions are clearly delineated, there is less potential for low-level managers to take conflicting actions. However, centralization has weaknesses too. Since power is kept at the top, decisions have to be made by top management, which can result in long response times. The rank and file have clearly defined job descriptions and don't feel any sense of responsibility in what they do for the company. It also stifles creative thinking and initiative. It just asks employees to do whatever their job description says and nothing more. On the other hand, decentralization shines by encouraging employees to take initiative and act responsibly, which can be quite motivating for employees, and inspires them to come up with new ideas and creative thinking. All of this leads to very quick decision times. However, if too much power has been decentralized, this means that top managers don't have full control over the company. There is a real risk that empowered employees can make decisions that are bad for the entire company, since they don't have the right set of skills to realize the full ramifications of their actions. Because each division is doing its own thing, there is high potential for conflict to impair cross-unit collaboration. Given these, what should managers do? Fully decentralized decision-making is impractical, since it prevents the company from maintaining adequate control and cross-unit coordination. Without this control, each division may do things that are good for the division but bad for the entire company as a whole. A cautionary example of this is the case of rogue trader Nick Leeson, who managed to bankrupt one of Britain's oldest banks by engaging in risky options trading from his small office in Singapore. So in practice, while decentralization has motivational power, there must be limits placed on individual managers' authority, otherwise anarchy will prevail. What practices helps a company foster operating excellence? The first is to benchmark or compare your practice against the practices of the best in the industry and even the best in the world practices, with the goal of improvement. You want to implement a best practice, a way to perform an activity or process that gives consistently superior results. There are three main types of benchmarking. Strategic benchmarking tries to determine the best strategies that can be used to compete in the market, while performance benchmarking measures how strong your products and services are compared to the competition. Process benchmarking starts from the gaps identified by performance benchmarking and compares your activities to other companies that engage in similar activities. The benchmarking process starts with knowing your own practices and looking around to gather the best practices or benchmarks that you can use. Sometimes you can implement them as is, but these benchmarks usually need to be adapted to fit your own circumstances. Then, you can implement your customized version of the best practice and track performance outcomes against other firms' outcomes. Best practices can be sourced internally by looking at the best practices of other departments, or externally by looking at your competitors who are similar firms in the same industry and situation. You can also look at functional benchmarks, which are firms in similar industries regardless of the situation, or use general or generic benchmarks where you look at the best firm regardless of industry or situation. Another way to foster excellence is to re-engineer your business processes, which involves the radical redesign and streamlining of activities for dramatic one-time improvement. The opposite philosophy to this is continuous incremental improvement, where instead of a one-time big-time change, you make gradual improvements in the conduct of operations. The application of a continuous improvement philosophy is called total quality management in the West and Kaizen or Kaishan in Chinese in the East. Finally, you can concentrate on quality as a whole. Six Sigma, which takes its name from the sigma or standard deviation used in statistics, is a popular tool which uses advanced statistical methods to identify and remove the causes of defects or errors and undesirable variations in performing an activity. The goal of Six Sigma quality is to achieve a defect rate of no more than 3.4 defects per million, which is an accuracy level of 99.9997%. However, because it focuses on doing things the same way every time, it stresses conformity and should not be applied to creative activities. ISO standards can be adopted by companies on an all-or-nothing basis. Basically, you cannot partially comply with ISO standards. There are two that pertain to quality. The ISO 9000 series govern quality assurance for manufacturing and services, including creating and implementing a quality management system. The ISO 14000 series are environmental management standards that focus on limiting the impact of activities on the environment, reducing costs of waste management, and continuous improvement. You have already covered quality control in prior operations management courses, so here is just a quick overview on the types of tools at your disposal. First is the ubiquitous TQM and its Japanese counterpart, Kaizen. Second, you have the Deming's circle or cycle or wheel that is created by W. Edwards Deming, who was an engineer and statistician well known for consulting work in post-World War II Japan. This framework consists of a four-step management method that deals with control and continuous improvement of processes and products. The Ishikawa diagram, also known as the fishbone or cause and effect diagram, was created by Japanese professor and theorist Dr. Kaoru Ishikawa in the late 1940s to pinpoint the root causes of a quality issue. The diagram shows a problem, lists its causes, and traces the causes to the root causes by asking a series of questions that begin with why. The histogram is a bar chart, which shows how much data is distributed in terms of quantity and frequency. If you know the should-be frequency distribution, then looking at the histogram of actual data will help you quickly see if there is an issue. The Pareto chart is a combination bar chart and line chart. The bar chart shows a histogram, while the line chart is a cumulative count of the total. The idea here is that 80% of problems come from 20% of the causes, and so we should rank the factors that cause these process variations by their impact on quality, so that we know which ones to prioritize solving. The name Pareto is taken from Italian economist Vilfredo Pareto, who was the first to notice the 80-20 connection in 1896. Control charts are statistical plots that help detect process drift or deviations, and are useful in achieving robust design. An example of a personal control chart is your EKG, which lets your cardiologist know if there are any abnormalities in your heartbeat. Scatter or XY diagrams graphically show the possible relationship between a dependent and an independent variable, quickly allowing us to see at a glance whether something is causing a quality issue or not. A quality control check sheet is a tally sheet used to collect data on the frequency of occurrence customized to each activity. Robust design is also called the Taguchi method. It is named after Japanese quality guru Genichi Taguchi, who applied statistics towards improving the quality of manufacturing. This discipline aims to make designs production-proof by making sure that manufacturing tolerances include unavoidable variables and ignores random noise. Poka-yoke, also known in English as foolproofing, is a subset of a lean manufacturing process invented in Japan. As the name implies, it involves a series of preventive controls that stop a user from making any mistakes in the first place. An example of this is the use of MagSafe charging by Apple to prevent the device being charged from crashing to the ground if someone tripped over the charging cable. And speaking of charged cables, the system has been refined so that it no longer matters which way you plug it in, so there's no way for you to get it wrong. Well-designed rewards and incentives are management's most powerful tools to motivate employees and can be monetary and non-monetary in nature. The most basic monetary incentive is, of course, salaries. Everyone is paid a basic salary to work. Salaries are what you call in economics as sticky downwards. It is easy to increase them, but once you increase them, it is almost impossible to cut them. In the Philippines, for example, you legally cannot reduce someone's salary in any way. There's also the psychological factor when giving salary increments. How much do you increase the salaries of your employees, whether it is based on cost of living adjustments or are actual merit-based increases? Giving a raise that is seen as too small will have a demotivating impact on the employees, and yet there is no hard and fast rule as to how much to give. It really depends on the company's internal situation as well as the external environment. In the United States, where inflation is lower, this is usually between 2 to 3%, while in the Philippines, between 5 to 6% is the norm. Bonuses are monetary rewards which are less sticky than salaries because they are one-time payments for a job well done. In general, the higher your position, more and more of your overall compensation comes from bonuses. Bonuses can either be short or long-term in orientation. Short-term bonuses tend to encourage a short-term view. Managers who get paid a bonus based on their current performance will usually care less about the company's situation in 5 or more years, compared to managers who are given a long-term bonus based on the average performance of the past 3 years. A major issue when it comes to bonuses are, on what basis are they paid? What kind of performance will guarantee a bonus? For most companies, this is usually the company's stock price, which is either based on standalone percentage change or benchmarked against the stock price changes of key competitors. This is very transparent and easy to apply, although its biggest issue is that this is something that most managers cannot really control and will not be as motivated as a result. Some companies also use accounting-based performance measures such as sales, net income, return on investment, and operating income. Since managers can control this to some extent, it is strongly motivating, but also creates pressure for them to massage key figures in order to inflate their bonuses. Furthermore, it is quite difficult to be fair to all managers in different operating units, especially in a large diversified firm. Of course, you can use the balanced scorecard, which also has a motivational impact, but also has the issue of accuracy for the non-financial measures. Furthermore, which measures should be emphasized? And how does an improvement in these measures translate to an increase in pay? The balanced scorecard framework itself doesn't tell us that, so this is something you have to figure out on your own. The final issue for bonuses is to decide who gets paid an incentive bonus. Under a unit-based pool, the bonus is linked to specific departments achieving their goals and objectives. Employees in a well-performing department will get a bonus, but employees in a poorly performing department will not. This will strongly motivate an individual manager, but has the potential to create interdepartmental conflict, since managers will not be willing to cooperate with other departments if they think this will reduce their performance and their bonus. Bonuses could also be paid on a firm-wide basis. where everyone gets a bonus if the company achieves its targets, or don't get a bonus if it doesn't. This greatly increases the goal congruence between the company and its employees, but also gives rise to something I'm sure you're quite familiar with, the free rider effect. Because they know their fellow employees will work hard to get their bonus, some employees will not put in their best effort because they know the work will get done regardless. Of course, bonuses could also be paid individually, but this is normally reserved for upper management. Group-based rewards typically work better because they provide some cultural pressure over the employee not to let his or her fellow workers down. Non-monetary rewards can just be as powerful, if not more, than monetary rewards, and work especially well for millennials and Zoomers to a lesser extent, since Zoomers are normally more pragmatic about money. Perks that a company can offer its workers can include the ability to work from home or have flexible schedules, having on-site childcare services in the company premises, access to free parking space, having great food and drinks in the company cafeteria that is free or cheap, offering attractive healthcare plans, giving in-office massages or yoga classes, providing mentorship programs for career advancement as well as educational and training opportunities for further development and growth, giving employees the opportunity to work in the company's other branches in the country and abroad, training employees to work in other areas of the business in order to expand their horizons, and holding annual or quarterly corporate parties. It is clear that rewards and incentives can be used strategically to align the company's objectives with employee behavior. It is actually possible to influence a person's risk attitude by changing the structure of their pay. Someone who gets paid a high basic salary with few bonuses will hardly take any risk since they don't want to lose their high-paying salary. In contrast, if the salary is low but the bonus is high, then the employee will hustle and take a lot of risks to get the bonus. After all, they are risking very little in terms of actual guaranteed pay. While strategists believe in paying someone what they are worth, the sheer size of the compensation packages of some CEOs do raise some eyebrows. In 1965, the average compensation of a CEO is around 25 times the median salary of a typical worker. This number has climbed to 351 times in 2020. Are CEOs really worth that much, even though, admittedly, a lot of their pay comes from stock options and grants that are based on stock price? Here is a table of the top 14 highest paid CEOs in the US. Although you may not recognize most of the names, you should know most of the companies. The only companies unfamiliar to me are Cisco, which is a wholesale distributor of food, kitchenware, and cooking equipment to food service providers, and Centene, which is a health management organization. Now, let's compare this to the highest paid non-royal civil servant in the world, Singapore's Lee Hsien Loong. Prime Minister Lee has to work for 45 years and change to make what Larry Culp of General Electric earned in 2020. In fact, the president of the most powerful nation on earth is paid a salary of $400,000 before taxes, and China's leader receives much less pay than our own. Actually, Philippines is on the higher scale compared to its ASEAN neighbors. Of course, the numbers here are basic salary only. It is likely that Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin and Xi Jinping are richer than their salaries would suggest. How do you ensure that your performance evaluation system is linked to the desired outcomes? First, the compensation is tied to factors that the employee being evaluated can control. This means that top management is evaluated on overall financial results, while department heads, teams, and individual workers are evaluated on their respective areas of responsibility. The incentives should be paid for actual achievement of targets and not just working hard or making the effort. Make sure that you use performance measures that are aligned with the strategy you chose. For example, companies adopting cost leadership strategies should evaluate employees by their ability to control costs, while companies that are differentiating should reward quality and innovation. Which measures do companies typically use? A 2020 survey by Meridian Compensation Partners LLC finds that companies still favor financial performance measures. like profit figures such as EBIT or EBITDA, sales, net income, earnings per share, the operating or EBIT margin, and free cash flows. Profitability ratios such as return on invested capital, return on assets, and return on equity are also used. A large majority of companies also use total shareholder return to measure long-term performance, and a handful use non-financial measures and board discretion to award bonuses. Finally, rewards should be meaningful in the sense that they are big enough to influence someone's behavior and are given out close enough to the performance for there to be a clear link between action and reward. Otherwise, the motivational impact is lost if you forget why you are being rewarded. Having a supportive corporate culture greatly facilitates the execution of strategy. Corporate culture refers to a company's internal work climate and personality. It is the psyche of a firm, its organizational DNA, and is shaped by numerous firm-specific factors, including its core values, beliefs, business principles, and ethical standards in actual use, management's approach to behavior, including its practices and organizational policies, the atmosphere and spirit that is embodied in the company's work climate, how managers and employees interact and relate to one another, how the company treats its various stakeholders, company stories and traditions that inculcate how things are being done in the company, actions and behavior that management tolerates or even rewards, as well as the strength of peer pressure that coerces employees to conform and observe company norms. Every company has very specific cultural traits due to a unique combination of the following determining factors. First, a charismatic founder and leader who is practically worshipped. The elevation of role models whose exemplary actions reflect the company's ideals, and the ever-evolving consensus on how things are being done in the company. Culture evolves over time and eventually gets deeply embedded in how a company conducts its business. Here are a couple of examples of corporate cultures. Walmart's culture is characterized by a zealous pursuit of low costs and frugal operating practices. It selects employees who have a strong work ethic and has ritualistic meetings at its corporate headquarters to regularly exchange ideas and review problems. Executives practice management by walking around and are committed to visiting stores in person, listening to customers, and soliciting suggestions from employees. Walt Disney, on the other hand, has a rich legacy and strong tradition of innovation, and its culture skews towards storytelling. Every job in Disney is in support of telling a story. For example, it calls the employees who work at the Disney theme parks as cast members. The company makes heavy use of training to inculcate the company's core vision and values into new employees. The company has a collaborative work environment that is characterized by a philosophy of working hard, but also playing hard. These two examples show the strong influence that the company's core values and ethical standards can exert on its culture. Values and ethics create a work environment where employees share common and strongly held convictions on how the company's business is to be conducted and provide guidance to employees on how they are to do their jobs and treat fellow employees and customers. Of course, this is only effective if the company walks the talk. Do you remember the 5 excellent values of Enron in an earlier module? Culture is not easy to change. As stated many times, humans dislike change, resulting in a situation called inertia. Inertia is reflected in Newton's first law of motion. An object in motion remains in motion, and an object at rest remains at rest unless acted on by an external force. Once a company's culture is set, it can be very hard to change, resulting in inertia. Fixing it requires us to understand what causes it in the first place. First, the process of screening and selecting new employees can lead to companies hiring only people who are already in conformity with existing culture and values. Second, even if they aren't, a company might purposefully or even indirectly systematically indoctrinate new members until they follow the herd. Third, companies can have existing lores and legends that romanticize various ways of doing things. For example, FedEx has 2 popular legends: how it was founded and how it was saved.
Once upon a time, a college professor told his economics class to come up with a business plan that would work. A student submitted a plan for overnight delivery of mail and packages. The professor failed the student with a C, because although the concept was interesting and well-formed, the idea was not feasible. The student was determined to prove the professor wrong, and started a company with his failure of a plan. That student was Frederick Smith, and the company he founded was FedEx.
The second legend centers around the early years of FedEx, when the company was running out of cash and was denied a loan. Fred Smith took the company's last $5,000, hopped on a plane to Las Vegas during the weekend, went to a casino blackjack table, and started gambling to save the company. He returned the following week with $27,000, which was enough to keep the company afloat, and the rest is history. Stories are very popular and gain a life of their own once they start being passed down. The story about the sea isn't necessarily accurate, as you can hear from Fred Smith's own words.
I was a student at Yale and wrote a paper about the computerized society that was on the horizon. It was pretty clear then, with IBM installing the big computers around, that the world was going to change. And the paper was about how this was going to change a lot of things, and in particular it was going to change the way things had to be distributed and moved to support those automated devices. And then I sort of let that lie. Didn't get a particularly good grade on it, as I recall. Well, I don't really remember exactly, but at one time in an interview like this, I said, I guess I got my usual gentlemanly C, and so that just sort of stuck, but I would just leave it at that, I suppose. I don't think it was prescient or brilliant in any respect. Then when I graduated in 1966 from Yale, like a great percentage of my classmates at that time, I went into the service in the Marine Corps. The Vietnam War had begun in earnest, and spent 4.5 years in the Marine Corps, and then sort of crystallized the idea for FedEx on the supply side, on the how to solve the problem that had been identified in that paper. In the military, there's a tremendous amount of waste. The supplies are sort of pushed forward, like you push food onto a table, and invariably all of the supplies were in the wrong place for where they were needed. So just sort of observing that and trying to think about ways to have a different type of a distribution system. That's what crystallized the idea.
In fact, although basic facts in the Las Vegas story were true, he did take $5,000 to Las Vegas, and he did return with $27,000. But it wasn't the company's last $5,000, and $27,000 was nowhere near enough to save the company. He also wasn't taking a huge risk, because he is very good at blackjack and poker. What the gambling winnings did, however, was to raise everyone's morale and buy the company enough breathing room to secure additional funding and save FedEx. The company you are joining after your graduation may have their own versions of company lore, which inspire employees to emulate the heroes of the stories and thus perpetuate the company culture. Another factor that locks company culture in place are various ceremonies that honor employees. Some key executives are worshipped for their heroic acts during their tenure, such as Steve Jobs of Apple, Elon Musk of Tesla, Warren Buffett of Berkshire Hathaway, and Lee Iacocca of Chrysler. Companies tend to reward people who conform with their cultural norms, and senior management may voice strong support for such behavior, which all but guarantee that employees will continue to adhere to these norms, or at least pay lip service to it. What can bring change and overcome this inertia? If the culture is not very strong, then perhaps a change in the management team is sufficient to change the way things are done. Usually, however, it takes serious issues such as eroding business prospects or an internal crisis that clearly shows everyone that change is needed. If a company gets a rapid influx of new employees, this is often enough to dilute the existing culture and change it into a new one for better or for worse. It is a matter of numbers. If an original company has 20 employees and a company hires 40 employees, the original culture is unlikely to survive. Causes of an influx include the company diversifying into new lines of businesses, mergers and acquisitions with the company acquiring all of the target's employees, rapid growth which requires the company to hire a large quantity of workers at the same time, and if the company expands into foreign countries. Whether your attempt to execute a new strategy succeeds or fails hinges on what type of culture the company has. A company can have a strong culture or a weak culture. A strong culture has deeply rooted values, behavioral norms, and operating approaches, while a weak culture has very few of these traditions, beliefs, common bonds, or norms. Strong cultures insist that the shared values and principles be reflected in the decisions and actions of company personnel, while weak cultures lack values and principles that are consistently preached or widely shared. Over time, the strong values are widely shared throughout the organization, since those who disagree with them will leave the company. Weak cultures, on the other hand, don't have any strong allegiances to what the firm stands for. Strong cultures exert strong peer pressure to adhere to cultural norms, while there is little pressure in weak culture companies to conform to norms and practices. Why does it matter if culture is strong or weak? This is because a strong corporate culture has a very powerful influence on strategy execution because of strongly held beliefs. If the strong culture happens to be conducive to good execution, then it becomes a powerful amplifying force. However, if it is incompatible with the strategy, a culture clash will occur. Peter Drucker, who is a renowned author on management thinking, has famously wrote that culture eats strategy for breakfast, which means that if both clash, culture will win. In such a clash, employees can become confused about whether to follow the culture or to do what the leader says. Most times, they continue to do what they've been doing because the leadership is bound to change. What types of cultures support execution? First, high-performance cultures, where employees have a can-do attitude coupled with a strong sense of pride and responsibility and strive very hard to achieve. The second supportive culture is an adaptive culture, where employees are willing to accept change, execute new strategies, and adopt new practices. This culture is receptive to risk-taking, experimentation, and innovation. The difficulty of your task depends on whether the culture is favorable or not, and whether it is strong or weak. The worst that can happen is if you are faced with a strong, unfavorable culture that opposes your efforts at every turn. Which cultures are particularly unfavorable for strategic change? Unhealthy cultures have counterproductive traits that adversely impact the work climate and firm performance, and can impede good execution. 5 particularly unhealthy traits include hostility to change, in which employees are cautious and conservative and prefer to avoid risk if possible. They follow rather than lead, and there is little enthusiasm to do things differently. Politicized cultures are marred with infighting that consumes a lot of energy. People jealously guard their own fiefdoms and cooperate with other divisions very grudgingly. There is a lot of inter-office conflict and vested interests in every work interaction. Cultures that have an inward focus believe in their own superiority and ignore other thinking. This type of insular thinking has the not-invented-here mindset and tends to underestimate the capabilities of rivals while overestimating their own capabilities. Cultures with an ends-justify-the-means mentality that pursue performance targets regardless of how unethical it might be, are also very hard to deal with. Most times you are dealing with greedy and arrogant executives who turn a blind eye at unethical behavior, which can cause a lot of issues down the line. Finally, if the company is big enough, there might be several subcultures that exist within the organization. This results in intra-company culture clashes, which can fragment strategic approaches and impede teamwork. How would you overcome these unhealthy traits and cultures? It is, of course, easier said than done, and something we cannot teach in a classroom. However, the theory goes like this. First, identify the parts of the existing culture that needs to be changed, and then specify what new actions, behaviors, and practices should be prominent in the new culture. Talk openly about why change is needed. What are the problems of the existing culture, and how will the new behavior improve performance? Fourth, follow through with visible forceful actions, both substantive and symbolic, to ingrain a new set of behavior, attitudes, practices, and norms. Of course, changing a problematic culture is a long-term exercise. It can take years or even decades to become deeply embedded. The bigger the company and the less the perceived danger, the longer it takes. What are some actions that you can take to change cultures? More substantive, forceful actions include replacing the old culture executives and managers with those that support the new culture, promoting the advocates of the culture shift as role models, appointing outsiders with the desired attributes to high-profile positions, screening new candidates for fit with the new culture, holding mandatory culture training programs, financially rewarding individuals who exhibit the desired cultural behavior while punishing those who refuse to adopt it, and revising policies and procedures to better drive cultural change. Of course, these aren't going to win you any friends, but sometimes you must be harsh in order to be kind. Less confrontational and more symbolic actions include leading by example. Do not adopt a philosophy of do as I say, not as I do. A firm that has a low-cost strategy should have executives who are frugal and have minimum perks, and if the culture change is to be more responsive to customer needs, then executives must walk the talk and talk to customers themselves. Second, hold ceremonial events and awarding ceremonies to honor and praise people with the desired cultural traits, and to celebrate each culture change milestone. Finally, make periodic appearances at employee training programs to stress the company's new strategic priorities, values, ethical principles, and cultural norms. At every stage of strategic management, the role of leadership is crucial. Leadership is needed in managing the strategy process, where the leader creates strategic plans, implements and executes it, adjusts it as needed, in order to gain sustainable competitive advantage and beat its rivals. A leader should also own the implementation process. He or she must stay engaged so they know what is happening and to be able to adapt quickly and immediately remove obstacles to execution. He or she must strongly encourage subordinates to achieve good results and operating excellence, in part by fostering a supportive and results-oriented work environment where performance standards are high and a spirit of achievement is pervasive. Finally, he or she must lead the process of making corrective adjustments and be quick to accurately diagnose the situation, exercise sound judgment in deciding which options to take, and properly implement corrective actions. What must a leader do? First, he must be proactive and stay on top of things, which can be done by constantly communicating with key subordinates, staying in close contact through the internet with key personnel in outlying locations, visiting with key suppliers and customers to get their perspectives, attending meetings and grilling presenters and attendees for information, reviewing the latest operating results, and watching and analyzing the competitive reactions of rival firms. Altogether, this is a practice called management by walking around, where top management visit various facilities and talk with different personnel at different organizational levels to get a holistic view of the situation. The leader must also promote excellence by treating employees as valued partners, fostering a esprit de corps that energizes employees, creating a fully engaged workforce through empowerment, making champions and heroes out of the people who spearhead new ideas, setting stretch objectives and clearly communicating an expectation that employees should do their best to achieve them, focusing on continuous improvement by benchmarking, adopting best practices, business process reengineering, TQM, and Six Sigma, using a full range of motivational techniques and compensation incentives to inspire employees, and celebrating individual, group, and company successes. This is strategic management in a nutshell. Strategy consists of 5 interrelated and linked tasks that require continuous fine-tuning and adjustments to strategic visions, objectives, strategies, and implementation and execution approaches to fit ever-changing circumstances. In all aspects, leadership is crucial to success and impossible to separate from the other pieces. How can you tell if a company has good strategic leadership and management? Basically, if you are able to say yes to these three questions. First, does the firm have a good strategy? Second, is the strategy being competently executed? And finally, is the firm meeting or beating its performance targets? For your project, I want you to critically evaluate your company whether it has the right set of capabilities and competitive resources to successfully execute the strategy you are proposing. If it doesn't, how can it go about getting it? And if there are factors that are incompatible with the strategy, how can it get rid of it? Second, what are some quality initiatives that your company can adopt to achieve operating excellence? Perhaps this can be part of your implementation guidelines. Third, does your company need to restructure its reward and incentive systems to better align its employees' goals to the company's own objectives? If so, what type of financial and non-financial incentives do you recommend and in what ratio? Fourth, evaluate your company's culture. Is it a strong or a weak culture? Does it need to change to a culture that supports strategic implementation? How should it do so? And finally, evaluate your company's leaders. Perhaps they have been instrumental in getting your company to what it is today. But are they still suitable for the challenges ahead? Or should they make way for new blood? Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our series of lecture videos for MGT 190. That's it for this video and this course. Thank you for watching. For chicken nuggets and below, having the right systems lets a company compete more effectively. This entails hard choices in research that ties rewards and let's dive a little. 6. And terminated those who place at the bottom 10% in 2 consecutive. People jealously guard their own fiefdoms and cooperate with other adjusts it as needed. Is the firm meeting or beating its performance? Is the firm meeting or beating its performance?